All right, guys. Our next guest is known for his fantastic analysis in both Morning Combat, the Luke Thomas Show on SiriusXM, and of course his very own live chat, which we love. He is kind enough to jump on and chat with us once again to discuss the big stories in MMA with UFC 250 right around the corner. Luke Thomas himself, welcome back to Submission Radio, man. You're looking better and better every time you come on this show. We love having you on the program. How are you?
I'm doing well. I am happy to be here, so thank you for having me.
Good. Just before we started recording, we were saying how the production value on your camera lens looks better and better. And I know it's crazy times over in the States right now, so it's good to see that you're safe. It's good to see that you're alive, and hopefully we can take people's minds off things just for a little bit. Obviously, let's kick it off with the big news of the week, seeing as we're back now. Jon Jones and Dana White have obviously been sparring publicly for about a week now, ever since this Francis Ngannou fight didn't come together. And I mean, given their history, it wasn't all that surprising, Luke. But the big mic drop moment came when Jon Jones seemingly self-vacated the UFC light heavyweight belt. I'm just curious, what was your reaction when you saw that? Do you think it was a warranted move in this chess match of public negotiation?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I have a big reaction to the dropping of the belt, other than it's unusual and obviously eye-catching and naturally the kind of thing where you would want to discuss it. But in terms of like when I think about like the most pivotal pieces of the story are, that to me seems like the consequence of a series of other things, and so I guess an inevitability. I mean, my view on all of this is, in general, I think Jon's claims to not being paid what he is worth are pretty incontestably true, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that's true. Even as we're recording this today, Bloody Elbows John Nash, piggybacking up off the work of Paul Gift, a professor I think at Pepperdine in economics, had talked about if you look at the amount of money that Jon has generated for the UFC on top of what they would already generate without his participation, so like the UFC brand, the rest of the card, whatever he was on, and then what his addition to the card in those matchups netted. We're talking about him getting a total absolute fraction of what he's generated. I think something like maybe even less than 1/4, something along that lines. And if you look at what the UFC has paid out, according to Paul Gift, in terms of that same consideration, I think they call it marginal revenue product. So again, what you generated on top of what they would have already made, your particular, what you pulled being a headlining act. UFC's only paid out 8.5% of overall revenue to those headlining attractions. So it's the claim that he has been paid what he is supposed to be paid is just not. It's pretty clearly not true, right? The dropping of the belt is interesting because here's the thing, man. And I put a video about this up today, and I talked about it on my show, which is if he wants to take a break and just not fight because it's a mental health break, he can focus on his life in Albuquerque. Like, who could be against that? He's earned the right, and it's probably even good for him. But if that is a step that he believes will lead towards effective change in the way he is paid, it's not going to work. It's never really worked. It'll work on the marginal ends of things, They'll wait a little bit till a big fight comes around where you're guaranteed to make more. They might make it for a title. They might bump the pay, in some kind of incremental way. But like, if you just look at the way the UFC allots fighter pay, it's 20% every year, 20% of gross rev, and even that includes USADA, so it's really like 18%. And that's it's more or less fixed. So like, there's no real way to change that. So you want to take a break for you, that's great. But if that's the way that's a strategy to meaningfully facilitate change, I don't think that's a successful strategy.
It's fascinating because a lot of people disliked Jon Jones, but as he was going through this whole thing with the UFC and trying to get this Ngannou fight together, a lot of people started flipping and realizing, hey, we might not see this guy around. A lot of people started to like him again. And I just wonder, Luke, because I was thinking about this just the other day, how much of the mental game of competition getting closer to him and him realizing that, hey, I'm not the same. The difference isn't as much as it was when I was fighting these guys like Shogun. It's more likely now that I've got these tougher fights on my hands. I'm not getting the money that I want to be getting for these super tough fights with a rematch like a Dominic Reyes, possibly Jan bringing a really tough challenge to him. So now he's realizing, hey, I want to try and make as much money as I can while I'm in this position. And we've seen similar things from guys like Tyron Woodley and other champions who want to try and maximize the amount of money they make when they realize there's going to be some tough competition coming their way.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that has to be true, right? If people like you and I can see it, I suspect that Sean's probably to a degree aware of it, right? I mean, all these fighters are very much, in denial about their shortcomings, but he's a pretty smart guy when it comes to fighting. I think he realizes that, to your point, these are a lot closer than they used to be. Thiago Santos took a scorecard off of him. There's a question about the judging in Texas where, they were rewarded forward pressure. What would that fight have been scored if it had been in Nevada? There's a lot for the Dominic Reyes one. So there's a lot of consternation, I think, and I don't know if that's true, but there's a lot of people are noticing that the gap has closed. And to your point, that must be factoring in both in terms of his overall fatigue with the process of being a prize fighter, and then, certainly that this next, it's just so hard to keep beating your contemporaries, man, because there's so much footage on you. They all know what you're going to do. They all know your tricks. It's why Jon's offense has kind of stalled to a degree. I mean, it's still obviously effective enough to win, but it's why his defense to me is really the key piece that fighters still have a hard time with, because while they're sort of worried about his weapons, they're not really focused on how he has protected himself over time. And I think sort of if once that cookie begins to crumble, the game might change for him. And also probably the UFC recognizes it too, right? They're probably looking around saying, it's getting a little dicey for him with a couple of these last few. So do we really want to really up the money now? I mean, they're not really in that kind of space no matter what. To be clear, I'm very unmoved by the idea that the pandemic and the lack of a gate is really a key factor here. When that was never in play, they still never bent to demands like this. So to me, I'm just, the pandemic can't help, but I just don't really buy it. But to your point, I mean, Jon's been doing this for a really long time. He's been doing it at a really high level. That accumulation of damage and everyone else's best practices and everyone else's know-how, it goes up. And the difficulty of maintaining that position with each new generation of talent. Dominic Reyes doesn't have the same name as Shogun, but he has been, I think his MMA debut was in 2014. So you can take a guy, in 2014 and you can get him that good that quickly. People are just learning how to train and adapt better. And there's no doubt that invincibility he used to carry, I think, has probably gone down. And as a consequence, these other considerations you brought to bear are there as well.
It's interesting how the UFC sort of didn't really want to get into the negotiations from the beginning, at least according to Jon, saying that they just didn't really want to talk numbers from the very beginning, almost seeming like they didn't really want to make this fight. And I'm just wondering, do you think it's a case where the UFC didn't want to pay for the fight or pay extra for the fight or give Jon what he's worth? Or do you think it's just a case where they just didn't really want to make the fight at the moment anyway for, I don't know, maybe keeping Ngannou around as a contender, maybe because they think that a Dominic Reyes rematch will do good money and they want to preserve that? John Morgan was on the program last week and he made a good point about how maybe Ngannou is like a bargaining chip for the UFC, where in order to say, tell Stipe, hey man, we're going to move on without you, you need Ngannou in play, because if Ngannou is booked, then you can't really use that, negotiation tactic with Stipe. Do you think it's any of those things?
It certainly could be. My co-host on Morning Combat, Brian Campbell, believes they don't want Jon to go up to heavyweight right now and face Francis because they're worried, they're not sure exactly when DC and Stipe are going to fight. And by the way, even if Stipe wins, we know DC's done no matter what, right? Mm-hmm. And it's not really exactly clear how much longer Stipe has. I mean, maybe he sticks around a little while longer, but I don't know. I don't get the vibe that he's around for 2-3 more years. I that's just a guess, to be clear. I don't have any evidence for that. But he seems very much focused on his life outside of fighting, and good for him, right? It's an important one that he lives in his community. So they're probably like, well, do we want to turn and burn Francis and risk him getting whooped by Jon, whatever your chances, whatever you think about his chances? And then what do we do, right? So now we've killed off the number one contender before he even really had a chance to fulfill that opportunity in the division. I certainly could not dismiss that as relevant considerations. I could not dismiss that as them saying, we want to do Jon Francis, but only if Francis has a belt in the line, or is more advanced in the process or something like that. But to me, again, I just go back to it. It's like, guys, the math on this, it's not ambiguous. The evidence that they've compiled, and John Nash and Paul Gift and others have done extensive work on this. They've shared it with the public. You know, when they write these posts, I don't think a lot of people read them. And I think if there's people, fans, fighters, managers, whoever, who feel like if we've not seen these numbers, they must not exist. They are public. You can go and look at them. You can see them for yourself. It's consistent, 20% across the board. It doesn't really change. So they might go heavy on one side, and they did a little bit, it's believed, to get Brock Lesnar to come back for UFC 200. But, you know, he had a completely separate negotiating position. For the people that they have under roster, you know, here's the thing that I think fighters have to wake up to. Conor McGregor was gone. He had Mayweather-McGregor, but he was gone from the cage for what? For 2 years? You know, as an MMA fighter, he was gone. And I'm not saying that the game didn't miss him. The game missed him terribly. But the game chugged along. It just kind of, no one said, well, let's just give up on this because Conor's not here. Let's just keep going. And if he had never come back, they're just going to keep staging fights. Now, you lose a certain portion of the audience that he brought, but the point being is the machine still operates. It still runs. It still pushes forward. There's still all these other fights to make. If that's the case with Conor McGregor, why would it not be the case with Jon Jones? I mean, he's the best fighter ever. I get it. I completely understand. That's Dana White's own admission. But the game will just move on. In order for these guys to really affect the kind of change that they want to see, it has to be a much broader movement, even with the most star-driven fighter ever in Conor, or the best fighter ever in Jon. By themselves, not really enough to make a whole lot of change at all.
I love your idea, Luke. You're right. Let's make Brock Lesnar versus Jon Jones. This should be the next fight for any chance to get Brock Lesnar back in there. But you have a great point. I mean, fighters have come and gone, and the UFC has survived. So with Jon Jones, that's definitely the case. And also without a live gate, you know, maybe they're not willing to put on such a big fight and not make that side of the money as well. But it's certainly a fascinating proposition, considering that a lot of people aren't checking out some of the live fights, and some of the excitement has sort of gone down with some of the current cards, so they could definitely capitalize on the lack of sport right now. But just wondering, do you think the UFC can go as far as make Jan versus Dominic Reyes for an interim or a vacant title? Do you think that is a possibility? And in a way, do you think that plays out well for the UFC? Because here you kind of get to give Jan an opportunity and an interim title shot without him going up against Jon Jones, a fight that maybe might not do that well. And this way you can kind of give him his shot and get him out of the way, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, people keep talking about, like, could this be good for the division? Somebody else being champion and then taking on newcomers, yes, the answer is that could be good. And again, will they do it? I suspect if John's really serious about this, they will. And I'm not saying it is a bluff. Let's assume there's at least one scenario where John could be completely bluffing here. They'll call it. There's no doubt in my mind they will call it. Dana White talked about Jon Jones potentially hanging it up. I think it was with the Canadian press. It was a recent interview he did yesterday or 2 days ago, where he was like, he treated it no different than Misha Tate complaining, you know, and he was like, yeah, the guy's made a lot. If he wants to be done, totally get it. I mean, he didn't blink for a second. So here's the thing. It's never good for a division, or certainly optimal anyway, for the champion to just offer the title up and then go away. Now, I get that it happens. It just happened with 135. It's what St. Pierre did, and 2 different weight classes. I understand it happens enough where it's not like terribly unusual, or like it's not a nuclear meltdown. But, you know, what really would be good is if, for the division, is if Dom fought John, and then if Dom won, and then there was this real torch passing kind of moment, and then you could build on this new guy. For people that John has already beaten to then, however you feel about that, and I thought Dominic Reyes won, but technically, for all intents and purposes, John had his hand raised. For those people, and I guess Jan hasn't fought yet still, to then, try and clamor for what's left of what John gave them back. I mean, when you had it at welterweight, when the GSP went away, you had Hendricks, who, I mean, he beat GSP up and down that ring. I know he lost, but that was like the damage he did was so significant. And he fought Robbie Lawler in this, I mean, there was hot anticipation. certainly Jan and Dominic are well respected. I just don't think it has the same, it just doesn't feel exactly the same. What would really be good for that division is either Jon to keep competing and winning, or somebody to take it from him. Him just handing it back, I don't think it does a whole lot of good.
It's an interesting landscape at the moment. Like, I wonder if ESPN at any point steps in and sort of, says anything to the UFC or tries to have any kind of input. I mean, you look at there's so many vacant titles at the moment with, the flyweight title, Cejudo retiring, and people saying that that's kind of a negotiation and seemingly looks like it's going nowhere. A lot of fighters, a lot of champions can't even travel to certain areas. Stipe, the heavyweight champion, is busy. So there's not a lot of champions that are really able to fight. There's not a lot of stars. I wonder if at some point ESPN are kind of like, hey guys, these cards are, looking a little bleak. You might need to turn the volume up a little bit and bring the stars back. Maybe get that Jon Jones guy back. We need some ESPN money. But also, I wanted to sort of switch gears and talk about the welterweight division, because there's negotiations going everywhere, like Jon Jones, Cejudo, and then also Usman and Masvidal. That's another negotiation that seems to be going nowhere, and that fight seems to be going further and further away. I'm just wondering, why do you think so many failed negotiations at the moment? And as far as Usman and Masvidal, do you think that fight ends up happening, or do you think we see Usman taking on, I don't know, somebody, and then Masvidal taking on the Diaz in the rematch?
Yeah, that is truly the $1 million question. And if you listen to what Jorge Masvidal has to say, and then there's some reporting about this, that the money that Usman is looking for appears to be, a non-starter for the UFC. And again, in what capacity he's asking for it, who knows? I guess we have to see. It's funny. That one is a weird one, because Masvidal had, here's what Masvidal did. He elevated himself to elite tier status, both in the rankings, of course, but in star power as well. And then once you do that, once you really, exit the trenches and you become part of this lofty elite, people who can really, from a mainstream standpoint, move units, that has real stickiness to it. But if you're the guy that people think should fight for the title next, and you can't get that done, that's not nearly as sticky. So I don't think his star power goes anywhere. However, with what Gilbert Burns did over the weekend, and now he's ranked number 1, and you can dispute that or whatever, but that is the position he currently occupies in the numerical rankings. It's like, dude, the divisions move so fast. I remember when, Evans was like, I got the title shot against Shogun, and they're like, you sure you don't want to just compete and wait because Shogun's injured? Or what do you want to do? You want to wait or you want to compete? And he was like, I'm going to wait. And they're like, it could be a long time. He's like, I'm going to wait. And then sure enough, here comes Jon Jones. And yeah, there's only one Jon Jones. I get it. But the point being is, dude, they'll find the next guy, and all it takes is them to have one opportunity. And look at what happens. It just changes. So the UFC might be able to save, candidly, by having Usman versus Burns. I don't think it generates as much money, but they also get a lot of that volatility in their business model that used to come from being really reliant on star power. A lot of that's been taken away. So to me, it's like they might go in a Conor and Masvidal direction, or maybe they want Masvidal versus Colby. It's kind of hard to tell. So I think that whatever happens next with Masvidal, he will be in obviously a prominent position. That I feel pretty confident about, and maybe it's still the title shot, but I'm not nearly as confident as I once was, because while his star power is sticky, his position in the queue for a title shot, man, they shuffle that quick. So. And honestly, how about this? I kind of think Burns versus Usman is a bit of a better fight anyway, to be honest with you. I think it's interesting. I actually like Masvidal to beat Burns, but I think Burns matches up with Usman better than Masvidal does. So to me, the UFC might just go in that direction for that reason alone, among all the other ones.
It's fascinating as well, because below the water, from the area that we don't see with all the negotiations, the manager, obviously Ali, manages Henry Cejudo, manages Khabib, manages Usman. I believe he manages Burns, manages a bunch of other fighters. And you have to think, how does that work from that perspective? And when you're negotiating with him and he holds all of the pieces to the puzzle with your next cards, how much power does he have? How much back and forth does he have with Dana White? And then how much can he just pull and put guys in? I mean, if you've got a client like Burns who wants to fight for the title, and you got a champion who's also your client, where do you sit with that? So it's going to be fast. I'd love to see like a 30 for 30 just on what happens behind there, because obviously the Carver brothers as well with Jon Jones and Jorge Masvidal and a lot of these other guys, it just seems like there's two big management camps right now, and there's a war going on behind the scenes. But
and Ali has it in two weight classes. He's got the same thing down at lightweight with Justin and Khabib.
Crazy. So it's absolutely nuts. And how do you even deal with a situation like that? I'd love to find out how it all works. But we just want to get your thoughts on UFC 250 just quickly, Luke. It's not the most exciting card in the world. There's some great fights for fight fans, but it is lacking that sort of big, exciting fight that's going to draw the casuals. You got Aljamain Sterling versus Corey Sandhagen. Kobe Garbrandt's returning from a 3-fight skid against Rafael Assunção. Of course, Sean O'Malley's back in action against Eddie Wineland. What's one of the fights that you're sort of looking forward to the most this weekend?
For sure, it's got to be Sandhagen and Sterling as like the one I'm looking forward to the most. But you had mentioned one. I am so surprised, to be candid with you. I am so surprised there is not more talk about Cody Garbrandt. Dude, this is a huge fight for him, a monster mega fight. Here he is. I mean, we talked about Dominic Cruz getting the title shot against Henry Cejudo and how crazy it was. And, Dom was unranked and he hadn't fought even since December 2016 when he fought Cody. Well, that was the last time Cody got a win. I mean, it's been that long. And then he fought once in 2017, once in 2018, I think once in 2019. He's been terribly inactive. You mentioned the 3-fight skid, although he fought well against TJ early. Remember, he dropped him, but he didn't do well in the rematch. He did really poorly against Pedro Munoz. And now everything is supposed to be a little bit different. He was kind of flirting with a different weight class, and I know he had that injury or the kidney issue, but he went and trained out with the East Coast Super Friends or the Mark Henry and the Cardell Almeida guys. And he's supposed to be, sort of trying to figure things out here. He's only 28 years old. He's got time to right the ship. Rafael Assunção was 37, but still talented. So for me, man, this is such a great opportunity for Cody to get right back on the horse. Honestly, they didn't promise, to my knowledge, Sandhagen and Sterling anything about the winner of that gets to fight for a title. They didn't feature them in the countdown, as I understand it. Just Cody, actually. Well, he's the co-main event. That makes sense. But I'm just saying, Cody could just jump up the rankings if he wins against Assunção and get the winner of Jan and Aldo, whatever one thinks about the fairness of that. I'm simply saying it's possible. And yet, on the other hand, if he gets a 4th loss in a row with this time off, with this time to reset, it is devastating. It is devastating. I cannot believe there is not more interest in this. Cody has shown you true brilliance in his career, and he's also shown you, when he's not got his head on screwed the right way, he's just a cheap version of himself. Mm-hmm. So which one are we going to see there? I really cannot wait to find out. I find that to be fascinating.
Well, I think the lack of interest just kind of goes to show how things have changed for him. Like, I agree with you. I was thinking about it the other day about how Cody at one point was talked about as like the next superstar. He may be not the next Conor, but like the guy who could carry the flag for the UFC. And it's like in 3 fights, he's gone from that to fighting for relevance in the division. And in a lot of ways, he's fighting for his career this weekend. So it is a fascinating matchup. And that's the thing. Rafael Assunção, he's the guy that Dana White doesn't seem too keen on. So if he loses to Rafael, it especially doesn't look all that good, even though, Rafael is a very, very good veteran. I'm just wondering, what are you expecting from, and we'll let you go, Luke, what are you expecting from Sean O'Malley as he steps up in competition, takes on a veteran in Eddie Wineland?
Yeah, I think he'll shine. I mean, I take Eddie Wineland very seriously. He had a great, I think it was last fight was that really nice win he had. But, Sean match made this one. He actually told me he called the matchmakers and was like, hey, Eddie's free. Let's put us together. And they were like, okay. And they did it. And to me, when his last fight against Teco Quinones, Sean O'Malley looked incredible. Like that time off, he was clearly working the entire time. And he's at that stage of his career too, where these guys, you see them, in January or whatever, and then you see them in July and they're completely different because they're getting so much better so quickly. He's at that point in his career. So however good he looked then, I'm expecting him to look even better now. He makes good split-second decisions. He has good shot selection, great movement. He just has cleaner mechanics than he used to, cleaner footwork. He's not ranked yet, and I think this is the kind of fight where if he wins and wins the way he can, he'll move into that position. Eddie is unorthodox, so if a guy like Sean can really, who's still young, but can lean on his technical gifts to get past that and doesn't get tripped up by the baseball equivalent of like a knuckleballer, then he'll really show you he's made of something special. So it could get dicey in certain moments. Again, Eddie's tough, but I think that when his hand gets, I think his hand will get raised for Sean, and when it does, I suspect that we will, learn something new. I don't know, but reinforce the enthusiasm about his potential. I think that will probably be there on display as well.
Eddie Wineland, what a legend. I remember seeing him back in his peak, and what a great career he's had. So interesting to see him still around in this big fight. Final question, Luke, and I'll wrap up right after this, I promise. Obviously, Felicia Spencer is taking on Amanda Nunes, and partly the reason why there's a lack of interest in this pay-per-view is because many people believe Amanda Nunes is going to quickly finish this fight with Spencer. Your thoughts on the fight? Does she have a shot at actually shocking everybody and winning here? One of the GOATs in the game, Amanda Nunes.
This is why when we talk about greatness, I know you remember Conor had that big Twitter thread about what's great, and Conor's definition was, in these punctuated moments, how great can you be? And that, I think if you have enough of those, that's not a bad argument. But pretty obviously, the other people on that list, the St. Pierres, the Johnsons, the Silvas, the Jon Joneses, they're on that list because what do they have? I mean, they've got punctuated moments too, but they just have this body of consistency, right? They're just consistent. And here's the thing. When the longer you do it and the more people see you, it just becomes harder and harder to reinvent yourself. So Demetrius Johnson has, one of his toughest fights is Tim Elliott. And, who saw Dominic Reyes coming? I mean, I thought there were reasons to think Reyes could do well, but dude, he did really well. And against Silva, there's so many people never thought Chris Weidman had a chance and blah, 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 blah. Like it sort of goes on and on. The hardest thing to do, man, is just to stand a post and see what comes next. So Spencer, I think, showed certain toughness against Cyborg that was legitimate. On the ground, I think she will absolutely hold her own. And remember, Amanda Nunes just ran through de Randamie the first time they fought at Fight for the Troops. Then the second time, dude, she had to lean on her wrestling to survive that fight to a degree. Now, she won it, but, on the feet, de Randamie was having her way. And, of course, de Randamie is very talented, but it just goes to show, dude, it's not really so much about, like, what that person shows you on paper. That's part of it. But the other part is, even though there's not even really a featherweight division sort of for women, it's just how many times can you stand up there and say, I'll take the next best person who has earned this opportunity. That is the key. And doing that over time is really hard. So what kind of chance do I give Felicia Spencer? On paper, nothing. In actuality, probably a lot. So anything is possible. Amanda Nunes, who knows if she's getting comfortable? Who knows if she has the same fire? She's expecting a family. How much is she distracted? Did the training get interrupted because of the whole COVID nonsense? Who knows, All I know is this. For Felicia Spencer, that's the most important night of her professional career. For Amanda Nunes, it's just another day at the office, and that can change things. So we'll have to see.
Interesting. Very good food for thought as we wrap up, man. Follow them at LThomasNews on Twitter. Of course, check out Morning Combat. It airs every Monday at 12 p.m. Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific, I believe, and that is Tuesday here in Australia. The Luke Thomas live chat. Big fan of that, Luke. The Luke Thomas Show on Sirius XM is now available worldwide on Apple Podcasts and Pandora. Not the full show, but selected highlights. And it's always juicy. I think it's usually about 40 minutes to 60 minutes. And I love when I'm on a long drive and I'm listening to it. So thank you so much for your time, Luke. Always appreciate it. And stay safe out there in these crazy times, man.
Doing my best. Thank you, boys. Appreciate it.